Buenos días a todas y a todos.
Good morning to
Bienvenidos.
everyone and welcome.
Welcome. This is going to be a conversation in Spanish. For those of you who wish to follow the webinar in English, you will find a globe icon on your screen in the toolbar. This is the icon for interpretation. If you click on it, you will find the option English. Mi nombre es Marta Rubio Codina y soy especialista en primera infancia en la División de Protección Social y Salud
My
del Banco.
name is Marca Rubio Cordina, and I'm an early childhood specialist for the Social Protection and Health Division at the Inter-American Development Bank. Again, welcome to the webinar. What do we know about the opening of daycare and preschool centers, which is a forum for the exchange of ideas and part of a series of webinars organized by the IDB regarding the impact of COVID-19 on children and the response on early childhood services during the pandemic in an effort to generate and share knowledge, innovation, and best practices in the region. The Latin American and Caribbean region is undergoing a difficult time during the pandemic, which is exacerbating even more some of the pre-existing development gaps. At the IDB, we focus on the promotion of social progress and the reduction of poverty and inequality, and we see access to quality early education services as a unique opportunity to foster the improvement of human capital, driving female employment, and breaking down the intergenerational transfer of poverty. Now I'm going to move on to some housekeeping items. We are going to shut off our microphones to have the best audio quality possible. After a conversation with our panelists, we will set aside some time for Q&A, and we'd like to invite you to submit your questions or comments through the chat room throughout the course of the seminar, and you can do so in English or in Spanish. You will find the Q&A symbol on the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen. Today, we have the honor to be joined by Miguel Sekeli, who will serve as a moderator for this conversation. He is currently the director for the Educational and Social Studies Center in Mexico. With a PhD in economics from Oxford University, he has ample experience in the field and has published many papers on issues related to education, social policy, inequality, and poverty. Welcome, Miguel, and thank you for joining us. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to join all of you here today. And I'm especially happy to be able to participate with this distinguished panel today. Before I introduce the panel formally, I'd like to play a brief 3-minute video that addresses the subject area that we will be discussing today.
Infinitas oportunidades de crecer, aprender y desarrollarse para convertirse en un adulto sano. El cerebro de un bebé se desarrolla a ritmos galopantes que continúan hasta los 5 años y que nunca más se repiten. Por eso, la calidad de la atención y de los servicios que los niños reciben durante esta etapa es fundamental. En los centros de cuidado infantil y preescolares, los niños socializan, juegan, desarrollan habilidades y en muchos casos reciben servicios de salud, nutrición y apoyo socioemocional. América Latina y el Caribe ha sido la región más afectada por las interrupciones de estos servicios presenciales debido a la pandemia. Los niños han perdido en promedio 158 días de clases y casi 7 millones de niños siguen afectados por el cierre de preescolares y muchos otros por el cierre de los centros de cuidado. Y aunque muchos servicios han operado de modo virtual, no todas las familias tienen dispositivos con internet ni el tiempo o formación para asumir el rol de maestro. Estas dificultades se agudizan en los hogares más vulnerables. Los niños han tenido menos oportunidades para interactuar con personas fuera del hogar y con sus amigos, y el cambio en sus rutinas les está provocando ansiedad, tristeza, ira y soledad. Incluso ha aumentado el riesgo de maltrato infantil durante los cierres. Los cierres son también costosos para las familias. ¿Cómo pueden padres y madres ser promotores del desarrollo de sus hijos si el 85% de ellos ha experimentado al menos un síntoma de deterioro de su salud mental durante el confinamiento? Las madres han sido las más afectadas, ya que asumen la mayor parte del cuidado y reportan mayores impactos en su bienestar emocional. Los cierres también son costosos para los países de la región. Se estima que 12 meses de cierre de preescolares costarán entre el 6 y el 10% del PIB. Todo ello nos lleva a reconsiderar el priorizar la reapertura segura de los servicios con protocolos de seguridad adecuados a las necesidades locales en base a la evolución de la pandemia. ¿Cómo podemos retomar los servicios presenciales de forma segura y localizada en un contexto cambiante?
Bueno, pues me parece que el video es muy elocuente
I think that the
sobre
video is very eloquent.
el video es muy elocuente sobre la relevancia de este
And it
tema que
certainly
estamos viendo
articulates the
hoy. Y me
relevance of the
gustaría pedirle
subject
a
matter that we're going to be
nuestros
discussing
miembros
today.
del panel
And before I
que
open
hicieran
the first
reflexión
segment of the
sobre
panel,
dos
I'd
aspectos
like to
que creo
briefly
son
comment on two different
importantes
aspects. The
respecto a
first relates to the enormous relevance for this subject. As you all know, I'm sure, especially all of those who are joining us from different areas of the world, and of course, our three panelists, during the early phases of life, we see some critical stages because, as you saw in the video, that's the time where children develop many skills and capabilities. But this is also a stage that we need to focus a great deal more on because this is a unique threshold. If we don't undertake certain development processes in children's brains, and this includes motor skills and psychological skills, then we see the formation of a permanent scar that cannot be erased over time. So it is in these early critical years where people, as children, develop their personalities and a number of different skills. So this is something that we want to place at the forefront of everything that we discuss in this arena. Additionally, when we talk about this sort of subject, we have to talk about health, social, and educational matters. And that's why the response that we provide for this stage of life is absolutely key. So now we have COVID. We have been affected by an unforeseen pandemic, and this has obliged us to come up with the response that we need to design and implement on the fly. We didn't have the necessary preparedness to address this from the outset. And this is something that has affected us since the beginning of 2020, and we've had to learn as we move forward to try and engage in the necessary efforts to address the problem. And so these challenges that have brought us together today are essential in the sense that we have to address them to come up with solutions. We have three very distinguished people as part of our panel. Maria Inés Castillo, Minister of Social Development in Panama, Liliana Pulido, Assistant Director of the Colombian Institute for Family Wellbeing, Maria Jesus Honorato, Assistant Secretary of Preschool Education for the Ministry of Education in Chile. So I don't think we could get a better panel even if we tried. So the idea for the panel is to share experiences, talk about what has been done, what challenges have been faced, and beyond trying to provide recipes for solutions that nobody has, the idea is to share experiences that can be very educational for all of us and very important for the region. And the idea, the final objective, is for us to continue this dialogue over time. So I'd like to welcome three distinguished panelists who don't really need any introduction. They are well known. And we'd like to listen to their insights, not only during this segment, but throughout the course of the segment. So I wanted to discuss one of the key issues that we did not have any background for and that we've had to deal with as we've experienced the pandemic. We've seen the issues related to the lockdown and the interruption of services, but now the challenge is how do we start to engage in the reopening process under safe conditions? And I would like to focus on three key dimensions that I think are extremely relevant. There are others, of course, but I think that these three are foundational elements, and I'd like to get our panelists' insights about them. One of them relates to the health safety protocols in the return to school. But secondly, I wanted to address educational aspects. What was lost? How are we going to recover from that? And thirdly, the social element, which is so important during this particular life stage. If we don't have the necessary conditions in place for children to interact and engage with their peers, then they lose something that's very important. How can we respond to that? So the question really addresses three aspects, and I'd like to pose them to each one of you. We have maybe about 5, 6 minutes for each one of you to answer. And unfortunately, if we run a little bit long on time, I'll have to chime in and cut you short. But I'd like to read these three questions, and I would like to ask that Madam Minister be the first one to respond, and we will be following that up with Liliana Pulido. And lastly, we will have Maria Jesus Honorato. The question is as follows. How has the reopening process been experienced in your country in the last few months? And I'd like to ask you to address the challenges, the various issues that you've had to overcome in your respective countries. And additionally, I'd like you to discuss some of the lessons learned throughout this process and the various changes that you've had to implement to address these issues up to date or up to this current time. And lastly, I'd like for you to discuss some of these things that were unforeseen, but that are being experienced at present. Many of these centers have been closed and they haven't been able to reopen because they don't have the necessary staffing available. And this implies a transition or a change or perhaps even a migration towards public systems. And these are people or staff that used to be the sole providers of these services until the private sector came in. So with that, I'd like to yield the floor to the Madam Minister. Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. And on behalf of Rocio Medina, the representative for the IDB for Panama, and Liliana Pulido, Assistant Director of the Colombian Institute of Family Wellbeing, Maria Jesus Honorata, Secretary of Preschool Education in Chile, IDB representatives who join us today, and all the people who coordinated this webinar and other participants from the Latin American and Caribbean region. Welcome to all of you. I'd like to discuss the Panamanian case, and we address primarily early childhood or preschool services that include different types of care and complementary services in the educational, health, and identity arenas. And this allows us to address the needs of boys and girls from birth to the age of 3. In Panama, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we established mitigation measures that included the closure both of schools as well as other facilities. So we had to work very hard to transition to virtual modes of operation and hybrid models that include in-person and virtual services. So when we opened the CAIPIS project, it was in February of this year, and it involved a coordination between the health ministry, the different regional governments, the organizing committee of the CAIPIS, and we used the guidelines and protocols designed for responding to the COVID-19 pandemic that was established by the country, as well as guidelines from the Pan American Health Organization. And this strategy that we developed in Panama used a number of elements used in the reopening process, and many of these mimic what our sister country, Colombia, has done. And we were able to see that the reopening process could be undertaken in a safe way using protocols applied in the proper form. But we also wanted to ensure that this took place in a step-by-step way, in a safe way, and it was highly participative. We designed a number of instruments and scenarios that allowed for the more effective decision-making process that is part of the CAIPI program that address some of the guidelines issued by the Social Development Ministry as well as the Health Ministry. And we established 4 indicators. One of them is the epidemiological element, and this was undertaken to ensure the safe return and care for these boys and girls. As part of this process, we also undertook other actions that we need to highlight. We conducted a situational diagnostic from these Skypes from the territorial standpoint, as well as the installed capacity standpoint and the availability of services for each facility. We also implemented an operational plan for the reopening of these Skypes, which used a series of steps and instruments to be able to address the indicators. So we established a standard as well as a traceability system at the local level, and this was done through a decree that provides oversight for CAIP's facilities operations and that addresses issues related to the quality of services in accordance with laws that apply to early childhood development that were enacted in Panama in 2020. This reopening also allowed for the inclusion of a process of legalizing these CAIPs and then addressing any issues in some of these CAIPs that were in non-compliance with the guidelines. We also had to address oversight issues with some of these facilities. In terms of success stories that we mentioned earlier, so far we've been able to reopen 100 CAIPs that are staffed with 632 individuals. And right now we have approximately 1,500 boys and girls that are located both in rural and urban areas. And I wanted to highlight that during these 4 months of execution of this pilot phase, we've only seen 3 positive cases for COVID-19 in children that have been attending the facilities in an in-person format. But these cases were related with the infection that existed in the community and not in the CAIP's facilities, which is an indication to us that the biosecurity or biosafety measures that we implemented have served to reduce the number of expected cases that we had foreseen. And this is in accordance with the standards outlined by Dr. Oster in the US and that we adopted, and has reduced the impact of COVID-19 in all of these facilities. 97% of the accredited CAIPs that have been reopened in the process maintain a level of compliance that is deemed to be satisfactory in accordance with the existing guidelines. All of this has been done in a collaborative and harmonized way with the support of the Social Development Ministry. Now, in terms of challenges, we've been able to improve the capacity for the staff of these CAIPs. We've also incorporated certain strategies to address the COVID infection, and this has been a key element for us to be able to move forward with the redesign process of the operational units in the CAIPs. We also established some strategic partnerships with different ministries and authorities, both in the health as well as social development arenas, as well as external partners such as UNICEF and other international organizations. We've been able to establish an ongoing communication system, an oversight mechanism that ensures full compliance with the established standards. And this has been done during the pandemic, thanks to the engagement of these pilot projects at the national level. Now, everything that we do also faces some challenges. And one of the challenges is to achieve a 100% reopening of CAIP's facilities at the national levels. And in the face of an increasing number of COVID-19 cases in Panama, we could consider temporary closures of in-person services in some facilities and go back to other alternative modes depending on the behavior or the onset of the infection in the community. So this, by and large, is what we've been experiencing in Panama as part of this reopening process for these CAIPI's facilities. Now, we started on February 1st, and we believe that this model has proven to be safe. It has been 100% voluntary and participatory, and we've had 100% support from the social and health ministries, and we believe that this has been a very successful venture. Madam Minister, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. I think that you provided a very interesting landscape for us to try to follow and perhaps even replicate. And so I think you've managed to achieve a great deal. And those of us who have been observing this situation, the best opportunity that we have is to learn from other people's and other countries' experience. And so I'm sure that over the course of the next few months, you will generate more evidence and data that will be of great use to other countries and to other people that are interested in this subject area. We see a number of questions in the chat or in the Q&A room, thanks to your presentation, Madam Minister, but I'm going to set those aside. I would like to leave one on the table so we can address it in the next segment. Can you share a little bit about that which relates to academic erosion, that is, kids falling behind in their school? I think it would be interesting to see, given this effort that you've engaged in that includes training teachers and other facility staff, have you undertaken any other mechanisms or activities to try and bring the student population back to speed on their studies and their school performance? And thank you for your wonderful presentation. Moving on to the Assistant Director of the Colombian Institute, and Liliana Pulido, I'd like to also pose the same questions that I posed to the previous speaker. You have the floor. Miguel, thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. Greetings to Minister Castillo, Secretary Honorato, and special greetings to the team at the Inter-American Development Bank. On behalf of Colombia, I thank you for the invitation to take part in this webinar on behalf of our leadership. And I'd like to take advantage of these few minutes that I have to thank the bank for supporting Colombia, especially within the context of the pandemic. You've always been very supportive to us, especially in these extremely important preschool and early education programs that we've undertaken, especially in our focus on girls. Also, the educational program that we've engaged in. And so for that, I thank you. I'd like to briefly state that within the limited time frame that we have, recently, the government in Colombia established some standards whereby we established the framework for the complete reopening, and we've tried to come up with a mechanism that will allow us to reopen 100% of these preschool and early childhood centers. This has been the target of many criticisms, but given the different impacts due to the pandemic, one of the things that we focused on was the neural pathways development, which is so important for psychological and skills development. Interaction with peers is extremely important at this early stage of life. So we believe that our program is the right pathway. So what happened in Colombia? In August through December of last year, we conducted a number of pilot projects that we referred to as exceptional in-person care pilot programs. And this is what we undertook to start to prepare for the scale up in 2021 to reopen all educational and daycare centers. So what was it that we did at that time? First and foremost, we defined a hybrid model. Now, what is this? We established that we could combine in-person as well as remote strategies in all of our service units to be able to provide access to educational service. We wanted to establish spaces, not only virtually, but in an in-person format. One concrete example was that if we have, say, 20 children in a group, then we would break them down into two groups, and group one would be attending school in an in-person format, say this week, and the other group would be engaged in school through a virtual platform. The following week, it would be group two that would be attending the facility in an in-person format, and group one would then transfer over to the virtual format. This was something that we deemed to be very important, and we undertook all of the necessary safety protocols that the situation required. We established a methodology of operational unit prioritization. And I think this is really important because this was at the very core of the success of this exercise that we had last year. So we addressed the conditions in different locations in Colombia. We had 3 states and municipalities that had different needs. So we conducted a very careful evaluation of the rate of infection in each location. We also assessed the available intensive care facilities available in each municipality to be able to establish some baselines and determine whether or not the conditions on the ground were normal or adequate, or to the contrary, perhaps in a critical situation. So we wanted to address how to frame this within the context of the pandemic. And in the bank, we came up with Mis Manos Te Enseñan, which was a rapid response strategy that uses a remote service mechanism to be able to reach out to children in their homes. So far, we've had 88 million calls, 22 million um, food packages that have been delivered, as well as other services. And as part of this telephonic follow-up mechanism, because not all our beneficiaries have access to the internet, then many educational agencies started to track certain types of risks related to violence, emotional strife in the home, access to basic services, water, and other services. And we also had to assess the number of migrant children that we had in each location. And we undertook the necessary analysis to have a better understanding of what the situation was on the ground. A third component that we refer to as health risks was an index that allowed us to assess the health condition of families. And we also started to use algorithms in this regard to be able to do a comparative analysis as well as an identification process regarding the levels of proximity that each service unit had. And we're talking about early childhood development centers to be able to ascertain what their capability was to be able to identify these indicators. So when we had cases of higher risk for certain children, then the administrative staff had to engage in services at a different scale and in a more direct way to be able to address the needs of that particular household. So Minister Castillo also mentioned the index to verify the current status of our existing infrastructure. This was done across 6 different states It involved more than 480 girls and boys that were in the hybrid model and participating in different educational models. And these are the results, which I believe to be very important. And you can see the breakdown here. We didn't have any infections with children. We only saw 2 cases with the teaching staff and 2 cases in the participating family. The biosafety measures and the immediate activation of the protocols took place with every detection. And in this case, it was a very efficient process.
This was an example of all we did. Hand washing, for example, they were the most resilient, the most judicious, and almost 100% valued positively this attention. 98%, 86% of the families and 88% of our human talent truly were happy. We can say that they had a very positive response, and 77% of our human talent said that attention and learning within this framework were better compared to what was being done remotely. And there are other results that we can give you. But what was the most important thing? The high positive perception and high confidence shown by children. We can see the numbers here. I won't read them out because I don't have enough time. But the resilience of our children in adapting to this situation was another element that I wanted to highlight. And finally, I think in the second phase that we're going through now, starting in 2021, with these 3 stages: selection, preparing, implementation, and monitoring, we have identified several challenges. Perhaps the first one is, after we establish a baseline, we need an evaluation, a self-evaluation for all these areas. We look at each of the service units and establish that our human resources, make sure they don't have comorbidities, that nobody's older than 60 years old, that there's informed and caretakers. And we have to apply the principles mentioned by Minister Castillo. It has to be on a voluntary basis and gradual as a process. We have succeeded in opening up about 2,000 child care centers.
Esto pareciera mucho, pero es bajo.
This would seem to be a high level, but it's low.
Y digamos que los dos grandes retos y el temor tanto de nuestro talento humano, de los padres de familia. Ahí vamos a iniciar precisamente la otra semana unas estrategias de comunicación radiales, masivas, reuniones con los padres de familia para generar esa...
And we need to prepare the spaces. This has been a challenge, of course, for everyone in the pandemic. And with that, I conclude. Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. We are already getting some comments from Panama. And just like the minister's presentation, there's a lot of interest in this experience. It's truly interesting to see, and even though it's a cliche, to see how during the pandemic, creativity comes up. And if anybody has interest in looking at some of these interventions, truly very creative. So thank you very much for your comments. And now I have just a question I'd like to leave on the table that we can address during the next panel. And the question is related to how Colombia's educational system is organized. We have states or departments, and we have municipalities, and they have a very active role in education. And perhaps we could give more details about how you have been able to coordinate the various sectors, the local governments, for all of this that you are doing and that you have just been describing, Liliana. So thank you once again. And now with our third intervention of this first panel, our minister from Chile for early childhood education, Maria Jesus Honorato. Go ahead, please. Good morning. I'd like to extend my greetings to all the authorities, to the IDB, to the minister and the deputy director who have just presented. Thank you for this opportunity to present as well our experience. And I'd like to extend a greeting to everyone who is listening, educators, people from the technical perspective, everybody who is a part of the educational community and who is interested in early childhood education. I think we have a lot of common ground in what we've done. I realized that listening to my colleagues in Chile. From March 16th, 2020, we entered into a severe lockdown. We had a first peak that caused all in-person classes to be suspended, canceled. It was truly shocking to go through this as an educator, and this went on throughout the year, and it was a very complex process. In October of that year, we realized that it was urgent to do something. The months were going by and we needed to do something and try to start coming back to school. So in 2020, by mid-year, there were a lot of calls for coming back, but there was a lot of resistance to that, a lot of uncertainty. I'm sorry. And what we focused on was what we were doing to manage the pandemic as human beings, as regular human beings, not even thinking about educators. First of all, we had to take a number of measures and make adjustments to the mandates from the Ministry of Health. That was our first starting point for this return. As educators, as an educational system, we need to learn about these protocols, make them our own. And that's when we were able to start generating a certain level of confidence and establishing a safe system and safe school. And last year, the Minister of Education really emphasize this, and it's been a very complex message to put out. We had to try to find the best options, and 1,500 early child care centers requested the ability to reopen. About 670 were able to resume their activities, and it was very positive to be able to evaluate this reopening. We did monitoring with UNICEF and universities and our undersecretariat. And what I'm trying to show here on this slide is that there was a very low percentage of new infections. Infections were coming from outside of this area. Even educators were thinking that because they're so close to the children, that we might have had more infections among them. That was a concern that existed. Also, the idea that children who were so young would not be able to learn the protocols, but together with what the other presenters have mentioned, there was a very low infection rate that we saw as well. And this helped us gain some confidence and see how we could proceed. The graph shows what you showed as well, my colleagues. What was the response by educators here in Chile? We use our grading system goes from 1 to 7, rather 1 to 7. That's our school grading system. And here we have the nursery rooms. Those are the JUNGI. We also will have the VTF. These are also daycare centers. Then we have the private schools, and then the total for all of that. So we see the confidence building up from the beginning. Educators as well as leadership in the school were positively impressed with this beginning of a reopening last year. And together with that, we were able to get an evaluation. We're looking at learning during the pandemic. We looked at children in preschools through standardized tests. We have a longitudinal study that we do every 2 years for early childhood. So we were able to compare results. Last year. We had been, schools had been suspended for 5 or 6 months already. And in this pilot, what we saw was a decline, which we expected, but a very high delay in terms of vocabulary, language, and general socio-emotional development. And this study tries to draw an analogy and shows a loss in Chile of an investment of 5 years, an equivalent of 5 years of studies with the mother. We know the mother is a fundamental element for the development of children. And in this study, we saw that we had lost this amount of time. So that's the equivalence in terms of loss of language. In terms of socio-emotional skills, we confirm something similar. Now, what is our current situation with the reopening? We have work that was done during the summer, and each establishment worked based on the protocols and trying to determine whether to work on a hybrid model, alternating kids coming to the school one day or another. And this was all planned during 2020, and we were rather successful. We had a lot of educators who participated. People wanted to get trained. We provided a lot of information as well. So our summer, which is in January, after working on all this information and our operation plans, each unit, each center with its leadership generated a plan. How would they apply the protocols based on their context? How were they going to lead up an educational plan, hybrid with alternating days or adjustment of the learning areas for the number of children's present? And we sought to establish 100% reopening to just prepare for a back to school this year. So we had the reopening in March. It was quite positive. But now I want to say that we are encountering a second peak that is quite significant. So that was a stumble there. And now after that, we've been working slowly. We have now about 5,800, almost 6,000 centers, not taking into account the private ones, which are about 3,000 more. And out of that set, we can say that there are 3,000 that are not under lockdown. They've gone through stages. One is quarantine when they cannot open, but then you go on to step 2, where there is still a rather high level of infections, but you can reopen. We have a regulation and an authorization for this. So those centers that are quarantined, there are 1,800 centers that, however, are available for activities, but it has to be voluntary for parents. They have to be available for reopening and flexible and gradual, as my colleagues have said. So we have 54% today of those units that have in-person learning activities that are taking place there with different numbers of children, depending on what their capacity is under the new pandemic protocols. And now we see a variety of different kinds of reopening. We see here in this graph that the preschools have only opened up at a municipal level, only open at a level of 9%. So we have a huge challenge here. Everything that's at the municipal level. We have a country that is going through an election campaign cycle right now, and this has had a much more significant effect than we thought for these nurseries that have been affected because their leaders that are supposed to be supporting them are distracted by the elections. They are mayors. So this has been a challenge for us as a country. But we do have some good news. By law in Chile, these that depend on the municipalities are now going to a public level depending on the state as such. So when we see this bar that says VTF, the local educational services, these are now being transferred from the municipalities to the state. And these are being more successful in their reopening. And what this shows us is that this law that was passed is having an effect. They need to have a support that is convinced that reopening is important and vaccination is important in our case as well. And this has been a relevant point. 79% of our educators and food handlers and technicians and the entire educational community that are present in these childcare centers are already vaccinated. They have received 2 doses and it's been 14 days since their second dose. So this allows us to be quite certain about what we can do. Perception of the families. After this second peak, there was a decrease in confidence. So this second peak had an important impact. We feel that we've lost a lot after March when we reopened with a lot of hope. And now that hope has gone down, but the perception of families with school-age children, if you ask them the question, would you agree or disagree that schools and preschools should open and that parents should decide whether to send their children there or not, they do agree with that. They agree with that proposal. And as a challenge, I think that was the second part of the question. We have a food program that has been very important with food baskets that go to the homes. And this is a challenge today because the families are living off of those baskets, and now bringing the food back into the schools presents some difficulties. Then the issue of confidence, there was a new peak, as I said, and now confidence is down again. We have a plan called Plan Chile, Chile Plan Recovery and Learning for contingencies, and we have training for teachers and educational leaders in terms of how to be flexible and resilient. And those are the qualities that we need for this reopening and to deal with all these changes that come up. And this is really affecting us in terms of confidence and lockdowns. These rob us of our stability. And this makes it difficult to be consistent. That is what I could describe as our general scenario at this time. Thank you very much, Madam Undersecretary. Great contribution. I see the questions that continue to come in. So we have a second block now, but our comments will be a little briefer than we had thought, perhaps 3 or 4 minutes at most for your responses, if you would, because we're running out of time. And I had mentioned some of those questions before, but we have new ones in the chat. For Minister Castillo, for example, there's a lot of interest in how you see the effect of these childcare centers, these CAIPs, in terms of women, mothers being able to go back to the labor market, being able to go back to their productive lives in whatever job they had before, or for new job opportunities. If you could tell us a bit about that, or maybe any other topic that you'd like to tell us about in closing. Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. We only recently, for a couple of months, we've been reopening the CAIPI centers, and we have prioritized the matter of the adaptability of our children to biosafety measures and socio-emotional support for them and for their families. We do have, and it was a priority, and the reason why we wanted to reopen these Skype's, in addition to the importance they have for early childhood education. But the other reason was to allow women to go back to work. Those care tasks that are usually the responsibility of women, that was affecting women's return to the job market. So we are still working on the data to see what the impact has been on women in terms of their return to the job market. And another topic that we're working on, and I saw some questions on that, our reopening began in February, but one of the questions we've been asked is whether or what influence vaccination has had on this reopening process. And I wanted to make the comment because I think it's important information as well, not just in terms of how many infections we've had in the Caipis, a very small number of new infections, but vaccination began at the end of April in these comprehensive early childhood education centers, the Caipis. So vaccination in these centers began after their reopening. And still, we have a very low number of new infections in the Caipis. And I think that is a very relevant fact to show that these biosecurity measures do work. I had prepared a presentation on other points that I think are important. I just wanted to highlight some of these other matters. We have developed a COVID-19 response based on a strategy that is comprehensive, prioritizing protection of early childhood. This is based on a UNICEF proposal focusing on parents, prioritization, and secure reopening. We have some projects such as your Kaipi at home, and this was one of the questions that we were asked about virtual schooling. We do have a website for Kaipi at home. It has a library, and we have also the distance learning modality adapted for children under 4 years old. And we have the Mochila Cuidarte. It's the taking care of yourself backpack. And it's a set of what we do to take care of 5,000 vulnerable children in conditions of extreme poverty in rural areas that cannot get Kaipi virtual services in their community. And then we have also our pilot program with in-person schooling that we're working on, and we're still collecting data on that. So we will have more details about that. And we're also working on strengthening prevention, promotion, and comprehensive care of our children strategies for our educational staff and for families through our what we call our school for parents, which provides counseling to parents. And we're working with PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, on this. Also, so we can get the necessary technology for this reorganization of our programs for helping parents learn more about child rearing and adapt it to the context of the pandemic in case we need to close the schools again. And just so we can reach more people, we are integrating the CAIPs to our childcare platform of the government that also deals with psychosocial aspects and other aspects of child rearing. And we'll be developing training courses for positive child rearing for parents and for teachers as well. So all of this will be in digital form. So this will make it easier for us to roll out policies for families that support learning, gender equality, and preventing violence. We'll also be promoting comprehensive care strategies through messages online, providing seminars and training for the timely detection of development issues in children, also, again, positive child rearing for parents and teachers. So just in very general terms, this is what we are working on in Panama for the reopening of the CAIPI centers at this time when we are still under the effects of the pandemic. Thank you very much for the clarity and all the information contained in your presentation. And we'll leave some time at the end. We hope that we will have some time for questions. There are many for you. There's a lot of interest in what you've been describing. I give the floor now to Liliana. We have at least 2 topics, but you can, of course, mention any other topic that you feel is interesting. There's the connection with other levels of government and at the subnational level, the coordination there is one question. And another one is regarding technology and the type of intervention that you've done. If you could tell us a bit about this in 3 or 4 minutes. Yes, of course. Regarding the first question, we've worked at 3 different levels, the national level, local level, and then directly with our operators. At the national level, we have a huge advantage in Colombia, the fact that we have the Intersectorial Commission for Comprehensive Early Childhood Services. It is an organization, it's an association, and its technical secretariat is under the presidency of the Republic. So the Ministry of Education, of Health, of Housing are all a part of it, and all these agencies, of course, have something to say. And here we have been able to do some very important coordination. And we defined, of course, vaccinating teachers and parents as a priority. And last May in Colombia, we began our vaccination campaign. We now have over 16,000 teachers and parents vaccinated with the first dose. We are using vaccines that are made up of 2 doses, and we are moving forward quickly in capital cities, and that has allowed us to begin to reopen in-person schooling more quickly, because vaccination, of course, is an element that we did not have last year for the pilot programs. With the Ministry of Health, we've had perfect coordination, and with the Ministry of Education, we were asking me about that, of course, even more. We've generated a number of joint guidelines and procedures for reopening and guidelines for our territorial entities. That's the second level, right above local, because within the pandemic, there's always misinformation. There are fears that are perhaps transmitted from one level to another, where at certain levels there are rules that have been put out for those territories. So we need to work together to guide those territorial entities. And with mayors and governors, we've had awareness raising events. We've even sent teams to provide support and explain the process and the methodology of how they can reopen. And finally, with our operators, we've had to conduct some more intensive activities. It's been more difficult there. And we're looking at a positive incentive. We're asking them to reopen at least 80% of the service units in order to give them a score. And we have an index called IDEA. And when they have that, this will allow them to have certain hiring and acquisition processes for next year. And we've tried many different tools for communication. WhatsApp, for example, has been a platform that has served us well. We've structured an app called Bienestar app that's designed specifically for early childhood services. And we're trying to generate a certain level of social monitoring here, and even more vulnerable people who perhaps do not have a smartphone and only have a standard phone, they can use this to confirm to us, for example, that they have received their food basket. So this is sort of the structure where we've brought in and integrated the technology, and that's how we are using this for coordination at these three different levels of government. Thank you very much for your presentation and for this very clear answer. We now go on to the third intervention of this block with the Undersecretary for Early Childhood Education of Chile. And we have a question for you, Undersecretary. Several of your comments have been very interesting to our audience. So what ideas do you have to deal with the problem of certain students falling behind academically? And if you could answer in 3 or 4 minutes, we would appreciate it.
Okay, you can hear me now, correct? Okay. Well, really, our main challenge today continues to be returning back to school, as it has been stated. But what we did was come up with a program, Chile se recupera y aprende, and this has three basic elements. The first of which includes strengthening the learning process and also includes social emotional well-being and support and coverage. We've seen a great deal of social emotional impact due to the pandemic. And when we began to implement the mandatory baseline programs at the national level, we were able to address some key issues and focus in some locations and different types of learning in others. So this relates primarily towards linguistic abilities as a first starting point. And when we talk about activities that are recognized based on evidence and data that are the best to be able to improve the vocabulary as well as technical skills, was something that we focused on to prepare these children from the outset using this baseline information. Along with this, we have videos that show the staff members how we can work through these activities based on certain basic functions. So when we talk about developing math skills and other skills, that was something else that we considered. But another important aspect of all of this is incorporating mobility. In Chile, we focused extensively on this. We have uh, focus on this, and this serves to allow children to be able to express themselves more freely. Now, we've had to work extensively with parents because we've had to establish a WhatsApp channel with parents. It's been something that has allowed us to share experiences, provide information through the WhatsApp platform, and this includes people who have basic telephones. So this has been a great support for us to be able to address some of the challenges that we faced over the course of this period. And we also have other programs such as Hoy Aprendo. And this involves parents working with us in the home to supplement and support their children's development through certain information that we provide to them. We've been working extensively with our teachers and daycare and preschool staff members, and we have the Quality Education Agency that provides materials that includes a diagnostic that all of these operators can use to ascertain what the current situation is in their community as well as the local population of children. So they can use these tools to observe what the current conditions are on the ground at the local level, and in that way be able to address the needs and challenges. Another issue relates to providing support and coverage, not only to be able to provide services, but also to garner more trust from all of the communities. And this requires extensive interaction with parents so that they can take their children to the closest preschool that they have available to them there were some questions related to private operations. We've been trying to set up a fund through the Ministry of the Economy to be able to support some of these private operations. And we've been working extensively with these operators to be able to support families in such a way that they can register their children in conditions that have really proven to be very impactful to people's trust. Now, we've also developed different learning metrics that allow us to gauge the performance of children, and we've employed many different applications and tools. Now, we have here the SAC, which is the quality education system, and it includes elements that are very relevant to our intentions here. We've been working on this program for 3 years, and communities, despite everything that's been happening during the pandemic, have really openly accepted this because it allows them to have more information from the relevant agencies in such a way that they can help supplement their children's education in order to ensure quality learning. This addresses issues related to language, math skills, the proper follow-up mechanism, working extensively with parents, addressing socio-emotional needs, and we've done so in a very organized and clear-cut way. Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. I thought it was very interesting that you were able to cover all of these different issues through some of these programs. I think that we have more than enough material to engage in a discussion for many hours, and I'd like to ask our panelists to see if they would be able to stay for an extra 20 minutes with us. If some of you cannot stay that long, then we could perhaps let you have the floor first. Madam Minister, it appears that you may have another prior commitment. I want to thank you. I do agree that this is a fascinating subject, and the ability to be able to engage with all of the participants and see how much interest there is in all of these issues is wonderful for me. And I think that there's certainly a great deal more left to be said about all of these things, but unfortunately, I do have to disconnect because I have another meeting. But I want to thank you for the opportunity. Madam Minister, we thank you for your contributions because they weren't just fascinating, but it also allows us to perhaps provide follow-up to what you're doing, and other countries can perhaps replicate your example. So we want to thank you for setting aside this time to join us today. Well, I just want to make sure that we are always available to share any information related to our experience to any of our other sister nations. Thank you very much. Very good. Now I'd like to ask the Madam Secretary and the Assistant Secretary if they can stay with us for a few more minutes. Of course. Well then, Madam Minister, thank you very much for joining us today and for your contributions. Well, now I'm going to go in reverse order. And we've seen an enormous amount of questions. There are too many for us to really be able to address all of them in the short time that we have left. We may touch upon a few of them, but we certainly would love to provide follow-up to all of these questions after the event. Madam Secretary, there's a question that was posed given what you mentioned about the prevailing fear in the communities and how it's important to engender trust. And in your presentation 3 minutes ago, you talked about these various blocks that you focused on and that could serve to address this issue related to engendering trust and reducing fear. Do you have a specific strategy to address this very important challenge? Have you thought about how you could address these issues in the coming months? Well, something that's important is information. We've been working extensively to try to obtain information on a daily basis. We want to be able to have updated information on all of these studies, and we want to be able to share these with parents because this is a key important element. On the other hand, added to this, parents in Chile are primarily engaging with us in a voluntary basis, and we're working to establish a different mechanism that will be reflected in the legislation, and we're working on a number of legal or bills that we're trying to push through our legislation. Now, we've also been working on different campaigns in partnership with different NGOs, and we're trying to focus the most important aspects, or we're trying to attach the greatest importance to these educational issues, and we want to bring in the parents and engage them so that they take a much more active role in their children's education in the home, in addition to what they're going to see in these different educational centers. So we are creating outreach campaigns and showing the information that relates to the early childhood development, that relates to different protocols in terms of the return to normal operations. And we're trying to provide information about all of these protocols to parents so that they can feel more assured that their children will be safe when they go back to school or to the preschool center. Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. Your comments are extremely clear. And clearly, this is an example of the wonderful creativity that awakens during these difficult times. Thank you. Getting back to Madam Director, in the case of Colombia, one thing that really stands out is the solid nature of these technical cooperations. You were talking about some of these indexes that you developed. Clearly, we don't have time to hear a detailed explanation of these different indexes, but perhaps you could share some links that would allow other people to access that information. Additionally, I wanted to ask you, in terms of the comments made by the Madam Secretary, how have you communicated your strategies and how have you ensured that families get involved and participate in all of these programs?
Pusimos el enlace a la estrategia Mis Manos Te Enseñan que
Well, I
tú
shared the link to the strategy in Mis Manos in the chat room, and it addresses the different indexes and indicators that we use in terms of facility infrastructures, the actual training provided to children, as well as other components. We would be happy to make these links available to the bank so the bank can share these links with all of the participants. And the truth is that Colombia is more than happy to support any other nation in the region that would like to learn a little bit more about the lessons learned that we've developed over the course of time. I think it's important for us to share information in that way. Now, getting back to the question, clearly it's an important challenge to work with families. First and foremost, we operate on the principle of volunteerism. We developed a document, a letter, if you will, whereby parents commit to ensuring that their children go back to an in-person facility. But as part of this process, we provide support that explains the conditions under which this return to in-person format or in-person facilities will take place. And based on the questions that I saw in the chat, we're developing some radio programs as part of an outreach program that will address the different profiles and different aspects. And this is specifically geared towards parents. And it employs a very simple language, how some of these protocols need to be undertaken and what the characteristics are. And the idea is to build trust among community members and society at large. We've had a number of meetings in recent weeks with members of academia and different agencies and societies, and we're trying to bring about partnerships because it's important to do that sort of work with the support of other agencies, and it allows us to address both general issues and more specialized focused issues. And the government is part of this effort and is part of the awareness campaign that continuously communicates the need and the importance of children going back to school in an in-person format, how important it is for them to be able to engage with their peers. Another key aspect in all of this is the vaccination process. So that's something that affords people a little bit more confidence. Towards the beginning of May, we had a lot of concern in the communities because not many people had been vaccinated. So we've now been able to ensure that at least 85% of our center staff has received the vaccine, at least a first dose. And that's a key part of the entire awareness campaign. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank you for both of your interventions. I'd like to close this segment before I yield the floor to Marta so that she could give us some parting remarks and can provide some of the indications on how to continue this dialogue. So clearly, this is a very important subject to all of us. All three case study examples are wonderful. Really appreciate the articulate way in which you presented all of your information.
I have two thoughts that I'm taking with me. First of all, it's not just about going back to what we had before. We have to come back with a lot of challenges. Some students are lagging behind. There's an academic lag. All three panelists mentioned it. There are some socio-emotional effects as well that we need to deal with at this age. This is critical. And then also there's this other dimension that's very surprising. And I thank you for being so straightforward and dealing with it and talking about it, the fear that some families feel. And these are matters that need to be addressed, and they are big challenges. But it's also very encouraging to see your creativity, to see how you have been able to deal with this in a very short time as you go, uh, as you keep moving forward. And another takeaway that I'm very impressed with today, and it's worth highlighting, it's not related necessarily to the matter itself, but to the way that you are proceeding in Panama, in Colombia, and in Chile. In all three cases, I'm very impressed to see that first, there was a very solid diagnosis. It wasn't just trying whatever came to mind, a very solid diagnosis database, then well thought out interventions, evidence based with pilot phases, not just on a whim. Again, there's a serious diagnosis and a serious design based on the diagnosis and on previous experiences. And then these are tried out and improved through time. Thirdly, very professional implementation. We have the human resources in the region to do very good and innovative things. And yet another aspect where, of course, we need to wait a bit before we consolidate it, but you have already shared some information with us, and it's about the result. And we won't be able to measure them until some time has gone by, until the entire coming back to school process has concluded. And this is something that you have already begun, but it is still in course, still in progress. And I think looking from Mexico at everything that's happening in Latin America, I think that in such a complex situation with such big challenges, it's amazing that we have such full, complete diagnosis, very careful design, very professional implementation. So then, even with all the negative things that the pandemic brought, this is something positive, and perhaps in the future, we'll have a more solid basis from which to provide services to this very important age group. And this is so important for us and for the region in the future. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. We want to thank you and express all our gratitude for your interventions. And I give the floor to Marta. Thank you very much to our panelists for their excellent presentations, for the extra time that they have given us to share the experiences of their countries, to provide support to other countries in the region, and for making the efforts to respond in the chat to all the questions, so many questions that have come up. Thank you to Liliana Pulido and Maria Jesus Honorato, also Undersecretary Secretary or Minister Castillo, who had to leave but we really are now leaving with a lot of new information and matters to analyze. Our panelists have also shared a lot of materials with us, and we also have some materials, and we have the IDB COVID page where you will find the website where you will find more information about regional responses to the pandemics and the status of the reopening of schools and throughout the region, also in-person schooling and childhood services, as well as services for the families. And this is frequently updated. And please do not hesitate to provide to us any material that you consider could be relevant and could enrich our content. You have our email on the screen at this time. And we invite you also to visit our blogs for steps in education. And we will be addressing the questions that we still have pending, and we will also post the recording of this event so you have access to it. We also have a knowledge hub in education for early childhood and a MOOC on emotional learning. Thank you very much to everyone who made this event possible, including the technical team and our interpreters. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a pleasant afternoon. Thank you very much.